Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's Lean-In session. As always, I'm Michael Linke, and on behalf of the Australian Institute of Architects, it's really great to have you with me again for this hour. Today, we're going to focus on your architectural brand. So in today's market, success is very dependent on how well you can adapt your brand to change and get your business and your architectural practice moving. So in this session today, we're going to cover things like why branding is so important for the future success of your business, how to think about your architectural brand from a whole of business standpoint, how to understand your audience and how they perceive your brand, and how you can create a strategy that works not only for the short term, but also for the long term, while not losing sight of your day-to-day objectives. Presenting today, I'm really proud to announce that we've got Amy Edwards of Marketly joining us. Amy runs a marketing consultancy which is exclusively geared towards designers, architects and creatives. She's spent around 11 years or more in the design industry, and she's seen through that time, design studios struggle with finding the time and the resources to market their practices effectively. So Marketly's focus is on helping you to understand your architecture business, your creative organization, and help you to identify your clients and your customers to create very achievable goals. And then they develop a brand strategy with you and a marketing plan that can be managed either by them or on your behalf, self-implemented as well, and with regular guidance to stay on track. And I'm really pleased that Amy joins me now from Brisbane. Amy, welcome to the program. Great to have you with us. How are you today?
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate you and the Institute having me on board today. I'd love to just say welcome to everybody. Thank you for coming along. I'm going to just put up share my screen with you so then we can start going straight into the presentation. We've got quite a bit to cover today, so I thought it might be useful just for us to keep moving. Okay, so let's get started. Revitalizing your brand to get business moving. Okay, this is a really important topic that we've got at the moment, and I know a lot of practices have been reaching out just in the last probably 6 weeks or more, really interested in how they're going to keep that moving. So what I want to start touching on is why is it important for the future success of your business? Because when I first started in architecture, I remember really vividly going into a meeting with a couple of different practices and talking about their brand. And to be honest, they thought I was a little bit crazy. I mean, I'd come from a background in retail marketing where brand was really everything. It was at the forefront of everything that we did. And it was central to all the marketing activities that we did moving forward. It was part of every decision that we had. But what they really didn't understand was that a brand is just so much more than a logo. And I think what happens, particularly for creatives in general, is they're highly visual people, right? So you see the logo and you see the colors and you see the collateral, but actually there's a lot more depth to a brand behind that. It's really about the reputation. It's not a tagline. And what I'd love for you to do is not focus solely on what that logo is and what that tagline is, but what is the depth of who you are? Because I think the main thing is we can get really caught up on how things look. But what we really should be focusing on is how things feel. So to do that, we've really got to start thinking about your brand as a whole of business perspective, because simply there's a lot more to it than just the logo. It's the result of the stories that you tell. It's the ideas that you value. It's the inspiration you're sharing, it's the projects you're working on, and it's also the culture of your team. But what I want to emphasize here too is that while these things are important to push out from an external perspective, from a marketing and a branding perspective, they're really important internally too, to your own team. Because we can't forget that your team are actually one of your biggest advocates. They're one of your biggest promoters. So have a think about these things from an internal and an external point of view. One of the biggest things too is that we don't want to just simply think about just like you and I aren't, it's not focused on what we look like. We're not sort of one-dimensional in that sense. It's more about our personality that makes us who we are. So it's really people and your clients and your customer groups, that's what they connect with. They connect with the personality of your brand, not the logo of your brand. So some things to get you started, and you can screenshot this, or I have got this as one of the resources that will come out at the end of our session today. But as a whole of business exercise, and this is important to do with your team, I would really strongly advise that, just for as a bit of a brand health check. Because not only, I mean, you might have a particular perception of what your brand is yourself, but your team might have a perception of it that's completely different. And you want to make sure that both of those align. So with your website, what's the first impression that people get when they visit there? Like, are they going there and they're finding, maybe you've written an article and it's from 2017, and you might laugh, but I have seen that happen quite a lot. You know, there's things that are 2 years out of date. But I think for those people who can keep things relevant and keep things changing and up to date, it's a really good, positive way to represent your brand. The other thing is too, like, try to change over your images that are on your website, that's on your landing page. Because if people are going back there, or you're driving traffic back to your website, you want to be able to keep that as relevant and as fresh as possible. The other thing too is how are you using your tone of voice to represent your brand? Is it something that's really formal? Is it more casual? This is really important about representing your brand in a particular way as well, because it does have a huge influence on that. And if they don't match each other, if you've got a brand that's quite casual and informal, yet you're using this really architectural design speak, and the two don't fit, it's hard for an audience to understand who you are as a brand. The other thing is projects that you're working on. Are the projects that you're putting up there or putting out into the domain, are they representing the brand that you want out there? Is it also representing the type of work that you want to be working on in the future? Now, with service, I wanted to talk a little bit about phone calls and emails and how your office presents, because all of those things also represent your brand. I know for many of you, you might have students who answer the phone for you, or interns, and that's great, but are they up to date with what the processes are, and how can they reflect a really good, positive brand experience for your clients or your potential clients? Because that's the first impression that they're going to get. And that's true about your office and your emails and how people communicate with each other from your office. With your collateral, do you have any? Some people don't. And I find it's really useful to be able to have a whole bunch of collateral that's ready and available to use. If it's representative of your brand, it reinforces that message for you, again tying in how you use your tone of voice to be able to talk about your brand. Partnerships. Some people ask me about partnerships and whether they're really useful. From a brand perspective, I think they can be, so long as they elevate your brand and you both have some pretty similar objectives of what you're trying to achieve. Particularly with partnerships, you get out of it what you put into it. But if you really want to align with somebody who has some similar goals to your brand, then I would be advocating for that. Your team and your culture is really important to your brand. Like I said earlier, they're your biggest advocates. You know, what are they saying to other people when they're outside of the office? Do they believe that brand story as well? So include them as part of the process, and also educate them about what's involved with your brand and where you see your brand going. And lastly, does your content match your brand? So if you're putting articles out there, is it actually resonating with your clients? So it's always a good idea to be able to have a look back at that and think, is this representative of the type of work and clients that I want to be working with? Next, I'd like to talk a little bit about understanding your audience and how they perceive your brand. We can get so focused on what we want to tell them. And I don't know if any of you find that as well. Like you think, oh, we've got this project and we've got these other bits and pieces that we need to get out. We need to tell people what we're working on. But what we end up doing is actually just talking at them and not really to them. It's not a conversation. And I think the conversation element is what's really important, because ultimately it's your audience who decides who your brand is. As much as you can put a huge amount of effort into, how it looks, the content that you're producing, in the end, it's how it resonates with that person and how they decide whether they want to engage further with you. So, my biggest advice is to invest as much time as you can in understanding who they are, not just projecting who you are as a business. So some of the things that I like to go through with my clients is understanding your clients in detail. And I want to emphasize detail here because there are so many different elements that make up your audience and your client groups. I've highlighted some just here that are worthy of looking further at for any of your client groups, like your demographics. I think that's pretty standard, but a lot of the psychographics people don't really tend to look into as much. And actually they're super important. That's more on your values and your attitudes, how they interact with you as a business. And some of those behavior things as well, which, how often do they use you as a service? What's the intent of what they're trying to achieve? What's some of the occasions that they might use you for? One thing I find really useful here is to write down all of your different client groups that you have. Who are those client groups, and identify as much of these elements as you can as possible. Be specific. The more specific you are, will help you define each and every one of them and how you talk to them and how you interact with them and the types of marketing material that you put out from a particular brand. Once you've done that, one really important question to ask for each of these is, what problems will they come to me with that I can solve? Because if you can identify those problems and you have a solution for them, then that should really be the basis from how you develop your marketing material that then represents your brand. So creating a strategy that works for the short term while not losing sight of the long-term vision. I think this is everyone's goal, particularly in the time that we're in at the moment. When I started in architecture, 11 years ago, it was right as smack bang in the middle of the GFC. And I think, you get in this cycle of grabbing what you can, working on what you can, because you just need to keep things moving. And it's really easy in that process to lose sight of that long-term vision, particularly from a brand perspective. You can get caught up in surviving rather than working on those long-term image and goal things that you want to really project out there into the market. Now, we've all heard the short-term pain, long-term gain, but I've flipped this around here for short-term gain, long-term pain, because reactive workflow can have a really long-term impact on your business and on your brand. The way that you get around that is to work on a strategy that actually positively impacts your brand. So what I want you to work on is promoting those projects that have really long-term value. If you're working on these reactive jobs at the moment and you're finding that that's not the type of work that you want to be doing long-term, from a promoting point of view, I would be focusing on the jobs that you want to do more of. So even if they're a year to 2 years old, I would still be pushing that out there as your identity of what you want to be doing in the future. I wouldn't say stop doing all the reactive workflow, because I think at this stage you are in some kind of survival mode for a lot of practices, and I think you need that to be able to sustain your business and maybe your staff levels, but that doesn't mean you have to promote that work. Another way around this too, when you're in this reactive workflow, is when you're doing your marketing and you're representing your brand, I'd start talking a bit more about your process. You know, process is still really important, and whether you're doing a smaller project or a different project from what you would normally be doing, the process is probably quite similar. And people are really interested and engaged in understanding what that process is. So I think where you can talk about your process is very strong for elevating your brand as well. Share your knowledge. I mean, goodness me, I don't think I know an industry that is so well educated. I mean, you spend 6 years probably really getting to a point where you can be an architect, and you have a huge amount of knowledge and expertise. And I think a lot of the time we don't emphasize that, or we don't put that out there. We think, oh, well, it's not really that important, or people don't really interested. But being able to share that knowledge is really important in positioning your brand and your practice in a really good light. The other thing with that too is highlighting your team and your team's knowledge too, and their expertise. It's a great time to do it, particularly now if you're in isolation and you can't actually physically meet people. Being able to communicate with people and show people's faces is a really good way to connect. The other thing is to tell the story behind your project. So yes, you could show things while things are in construction, but why not tell the story about some of those projects that might be a little bit older? Maybe they're 1 to 2 years old, and maybe you haven't actually shared the story behind the project. How did it come to be a part of your business, and what kind of approach did you take working with clients or with consultants? What were some of the challenges, and what were some of the solutions that you came with along the way? The biggest thing here with anything that you do, for it to be a strategy that's going to have a really positive impact, just always come back to remembering that it's make it relevant to your audience. Again, it's not just always about you. Yes, it can be about your projects, but make it relevant to your audience. The other thing I really want to emphasize here too is success of branding and of marketing in general isn't something that's going to happen overnight. It's really about having a commitment to your brand, and it's a commitment to your identity, and it's also a commitment to your reputation. So really focus on those things, particularly the commitment and consistency. I think those two things are really what's going to elevate your brand now, and also to be able to gain work in sort of 6 to 12 months' time. Now, many of you have probably been asking, well, how can I actually use this time to my advantage? I know there are many practices out there who have staff on JobKeeper, and they're not really sure how they should be using that staff during this time. And I would say maximize as much as you can their time and their resources that they have available and their knowledge, because you're really not going to get that time again. Well, hopefully we won't. I don't particularly want everyone to go on lockdown in Australia again. But this is a great time to get things done. Take a really objective look at your brand with fresh eyes, and really start to determine some of those, where some of those improvements can be made, because now's really the time to do it. And if you do have time to do it, and you do have the resources available, Don't have your team sitting at home. Try and get them involved as much as possible in developing your brand, because you've got the time and you've got the resources available. I would really encourage you to do this collectively with your team where possible. Look at your brand vision and your mission and your goals. I find what tends to happen is you might set this at the start of your business. You're really super enthusiastic about where you see your future heading. But then when you get a bit further into business, it sort of sits on the back seat. You don't really look at it. And it's pretty rare that you go back and have a check-in with it. It's a perfect time to do it, but also it helps reestablish, is the vision that I have for my brand the same as what my staff have? And also, is it the impression that my customer group or my client group is getting? Being dedicated to understanding that really well will set you up for the next 6 to 12 months. Update your website. I can't emphasize that enough. Rotate things around, freshen it up as much as possible, and look at your search engine optimization. So that's the SEO. There's quite a lot that you can do now. I think all the Google bots and the artificial intelligence that's out there at the moment, it's really more about, I think it used to be more so on keywords and being able to find keywords that match with people's search terms. But actually now what it's more about is creating really, really good content. There are little tricks that you can do with SEO. I would Google some of that if you can, even down to labeling your images that you put up on your website with some words in there that people might use as a search term is really useful. But there's plenty of tips and ideas on how you can do that yourself. It's not difficult to do, but it can actually make a really big impact for your business. Work on your collateral. Have those things ready so that when things do start to pick up, or when you are starting to get those inquiries, you're ready to go. Having collateral about your staff members, your team, your business, and being able to communicate what your brand is and what it stands for is really important at this point. Another thing to look at is your social media presence. Are you using the platforms that your audience are actually going to? So this goes back to, this goes back to understanding who your audience is and some of their key drivers. Are they actually online? Is that important to them? Maybe they use email more. Perhaps they are actually just on the phone, and social media is not really important. I'm sure many of you know that social media can suck up a lot of time. It can become a time waster, but where possible, if you can manage that and be able to post in places that you're going to have the highest interaction, then I would focus on that kind of things to develop your brand. The other thing is digital and your print marketing. I think this is a little bit hard to go into as an area, because I think at the moment people are quite overwhelmed by just a digital impact. So how can you make it different and unique so that people are engaging with that? So if you're sending collateral via email, how are they receiving that? How is a client receiving that, or a potential client? Do you need to think about it not being in a PDF? Like, is there something that makes it more of a tangible and tactile thing? Like, is there something like a magazine portal online that people can do where they're flicking through the pages so they have that sense of it being a real thing? I think there is going to be a bit of a pushback to some print marketing as well, simply because people are switching off online a little bit. And I think you potentially can have a lot of impact in something that's hand delivered and something that's tactile. I know a lot of you love beautiful collateral and beautiful materials, so I think this could be a good option as well. The other thing is focusing on your content. Like I said, you probably have a team who've got a huge amount of knowledge to share and time potentially to do some research. I would be using this time to create as much good content as possible. I mean, you don't have to get it out all immediately. Like, have a think about creating a library of content. Go back to your audience analysis and understanding, okay, what is it? What problems can we solve for them? Can we write some content that helps them understand our process or understand how I can help them? I think that's really important and very worthwhile for your brand. I think refreshing your team's brand knowledge is really important during this time, particularly if you go back to your brand vision and your mission and your goals and you realize actually they're really out of date. I really need to realign where we're headed. Keep your team informed, because remember, they're really one of your best advocates. And then also, don't be afraid to look at new ways to reach your audience. Think outside the box a little bit. I think there is a lot of people who are out there marketing themselves at the moment, and it's a very noisy environment. So any ways that you can set yourself apart from other people, don't be afraid to do something different, and give it a try. Now's the time to do it. A big part of your success now is about setting goals, measuring them, and then adapting where you can. Success in the next sort of 6 to 12 months is really going to be dependent on what you do in the next 3 to 6 months. I advise to start really small. Don't bite off more than you can chew. Look sort of 3 to 6 months ahead. I think at this stage, it would be very difficult from a branding perspective and from a marketing perspective to think beyond 6 months. Things are changing very, very quickly. I would advise that you measure monthly. You look at the statistics of people. Look at your analytics of people coming to your website. What are they clicking on? What are they interested in? Where are people coming from? That will also influence then what information you put out there and on what platform. And then also just celebrate the successes that you have. If they're, no matter how small they are, of things that you're putting out there, what's working, and celebrate that. Learn from your mistakes. Don't be afraid to own a mistake and say, actually, that didn't work this time. Let's try something different. And then adapt your approach each month as well. It's really important at this moment for you to be able to adapt wherever you can so that you can remain relevant. A big one, and I know plenty of you will probably say, put your hand up and say, this is me. I always wait for something to be perfect before I put it out there. I have seen a huge number of practices who do, as an example, want to put out an email newsletter, and they might go round and round in circles about this email newsletter and tinkering with it and making sure it's really perfect. And then in the end, they don't actually send it out, because by the time they get to that point, all the information is irrelevant and it's out of date. I think if you wait for it to be perfect, it might actually never happen. The aim of your marketing and your branding is to be front of mind, and it's to be consistent. When you're in that moment, don't overthink it. Just commit to getting things out there. We have to remember that whatever we're putting out there into the world is probably seen only for a really short amount of time. So if you're putting things on social media, people will scroll, and then they've seen it and they've moved on to the next thing. Same goes for an email newsletter. People click it open, they might scroll, click on something that they're interested in, but then they've moved on. It is about being consistent, and if you can have that front of mind, I think it is useful. Even if it's only seen for a short amount of time, it is still beneficial to your brand overall. There's one video which I'm going to not show you just now because we're just having a little bit of issues just trying to load it up, but I will add it to our resource list because I think it's important to remember that the logo isn't the entirety of your brand. Your logo is a mark and your brand is a feeling. And what I'd like to do is for you to see some of these, this video, particularly from Nike, because I think most people know the brand really, really well. But I think what happens is it shows you that actually there's a lot more depth to a brand than just a logo. We have some resources available as well, which the Institute will send out to you at the conclusion of this too. So feel free to look into those and send through any questions that you may have after this event, and I'm happy to answer those for you. And I think, Michael, that's sort of the end for me at the minute, but I'm happy to answer any questions that they may have.
No worries. Thank you so much, Amy Edwards of Marketly. A number of questions have come through to me privately on email and also in the chat. So if you don't mind, I'd like to just go through a couple of them with you. The first one, this is an interesting question, and I'm not sure what the answer is, but a question from one of the viewers talks about the request to get conversation happening. So it's all good to have collateral, it's all good to have a really strong established brand, but in terms of conversational aspects of marketing, how to battle the stereotype that architects are expensive, that architects can sometimes be unnecessary. We know that not to be true ourselves, but what sort of recommendations would you give us in terms of being able to deliver a very compelling brand proposition that says, you know what, this is why you need an architect on this job? What would your response be to such a question?
I think it really comes down to, it does come down to outcomes. And I think if you can prove that what you do has a positive outcome on for a client or for sales or anything like that, I think, or for visitors to a certain area, I think this is hugely useful. And I actually don't think a lot of people do it. A lot of practices avoid doing it. And I think that's because they feel like it's a sales pitch. But we've got to remember that the clients that we're usually talking to, you know, that's what they understand. You know, that's the language that they understand. They don't understand necessarily the archi speak stuff, but facts and figures and results is what they're after.
Another question that's come in is in relation to how fixed a brand should be in the context of architecture. I suppose in the way that the vision of a fixed concept of a company and the goals of how that vision is achieved is flexible. Are there any examples of brand being flexible and evolutionary, so to speak?
Yeah, look, I absolutely strongly believe that a brand should evolve over time. There is no way that a brand that you started 20 years ago is going to be the same today, and you really have to continually evolve. And that's not just from the sake of your own identity as a business or own identity as a practice, but it's also what's happening in the greater world. Like I think 20 years ago, you know, environmental factors weren't a huge part of design and where we were going and how we marketed ourselves, whereas now that's really important. Things change and you need to evolve. I definitely don't think it's a stagnant thing at all.
In terms of culture, right? So culture is critically important. You know, when you walk into an architectural practice and it's buzzing, it's humming, people are really productive, there's a really positive spirit. How do you get, and my question to you, I suppose, is about anecdotal evidence of driving brand through organizational culture. Have you seen any correlation? What companies are doing it well? Have you got any examples of where you can see culture and brand coming together very well?
Yeah, I think I love what BVN's been doing. I think they do a really good job of connecting their brand with their people, and I think that's because they keep this really open communication with their team, and also because they understand who their team are and what's important to them. You know, they're almost treating their team as another audience. Does that make sense? So, you know, they're thinking, oh, well, you know, they don't want people to work overtime. So they've put in strategies and things in place so that doesn't have to happen. And, you know, as a business as a whole, they strongly believe in that. And I think that really does help culture. You know, there is an element of culture being somewhat the responsibility of the team as well, but I think it goes both ways.
Quite often with many architectural practices that, you know, we engage with, and you go to their website, it always has the principles, you know, featured very well, and then it's just sort of got an A to Z list of everybody else. And Tony raises a good point on the chat. The staff profiles on the BVN website, if anybody ever wants some time, you've got 5 minutes, go into the BVN website, have a look. They have everybody there, and it talks about what they get up to on the weekend, and you get a real understanding of the passion for the place and what people do there and how they contribute. It's a really beautiful example that you do raise.
Yeah.
Look, as always, we have a number of young people on this Zoom call, and a lot of them are looking at, setting out on their own, establishing their own practice, and so they've asked a number of questions. And I suppose one of the questions is, what would be some really good strategies for our emerging architects, those that are recently registered, looking to set out on their own, perhaps have very little to show in terms of the portfolio that they've worked on, for example, not under a previous employer as such, but their own particular work. What would your recommendations be to the next generation of architectural talent who are setting out?
That's a really important question, and I think this is relevant to people who are just starting out. Yes, they're new graduates, but there's also people who've been in practice for a really long period of time. They've decided to go out on their own, and they actually can't use that collateral or the images to be able to promote themselves. And there is usually that lag of time between them getting new work and being able to promote themselves. I think a big part is being able to do some personal branding around that. And I think I would emphasize more so creating content around your knowledge areas and your expertise areas, and having an opinion. I think people get a little bit scared of sharing an opinion, but I think that is what gets you noticed. And I think if you're an up and coming person, I mean, as long as you're not poking the bear too much, but I think if you're putting a good view out there and you're really passionate about something, get behind that passion and really push that out there as much as possible.
And in terms of face-to-face physical activity, in terms of meeting people and actually getting your brand awareness out there, what are some key recommendations for those younger architects who are looking to maybe pound the streets and knock on a few doors and try and engage business that way?
I think, conversation and relationships are hugely important for service businesses, and you've got to put a huge amount of effort into that. I am more of an advocate for being able to think about what's important to that person. How can you understand more about the person that you're meeting? This is about having a genuine interest. You're not starting a relationship to be in it for a short gain or a short term. This is a long-term game. If you're in it for the long term, then invest energy in getting to know those people really well, get to know their projects, understand what some of their pain points are, and seeing how you might be able to help them.
In terms of emerging trends, I mean, you're based in Brisbane, I'm here in Melbourne, but you work with clients all across Australia. From the conversations that I've had and from the conversations that you've had, what are some of the key trends that you're seeing coming out? Obviously, we are healing ourselves from COVID-19 with the exception of my state. What's happening in Brisbane? What's happening in Sydney? What's happening in WA? The areas that you're working in, what are some of the key sort of trends post-COVID now that you're seeing your clients engage with and foster?
And do you mean from a brand point of view, or
yeah, just I suppose from an operational perspective, from a staffing perspective, how they're engaging with the public in a new era of intense sort of personal hygiene, all of those sort of things.
I think how they're talking with people is there's a lot more of just picking up the phone. I think we have all got into that bad habit of just sending an email to people and hoping that that's going to be enough. And I don't think it is. And I think what's happening now is people are realizing that it's easier to make a phone call. Just like Instagram and all of our digital worlds are being really overwhelmed, so to our emails, they're overflowing. Like I know a lot of practice directors at the moment who are just not coping with the level of stuff that's coming into their inbox, and people being remote and having to communicate that way. So I think as much as possible where you can communicate either in person or on the phone is really important. I think we're all in a big transition from a staffing perspective. I probably have some personal opinions about how we can keep culture really strong, and within those businesses, I think communicate with them as much as possible. Keep it in transparent and an open dialogue where possible. But from a branding perspective and a marketing perspective, there's so much more that's going for really good content. I would invest heavily in creating great content wherever possible.
Okay, great stuff. Well, we might leave it there if that's okay. Amy Edwards of Marketly, great to have you on the program. Thank you so much for your presentation. And a reminder to everybody, yes, this session is being recorded. So this will be available later on this afternoon on our dedicated COVID-19 resource webpage. So thank you so much to you, Amy. It's been great to have you with us. So that is it for today. I will say just a quick shout out. We are going to continue the marketing theme. And that will go through till next Tuesday, the 4th of August. If you are available, 12 noon Australian Eastern Standard Time, join me again. We're going to be taking a different look at marketing for architects, but looking at how we get a helicopter view of what's working in your practice. And joining me is Rachel Bernstone, a well-respected marketing guru who services the architectural profession. And she'll be working with us on how to sort of do a 360 good full health check on architectural practices. So do join me then at 12 noon. Until then, I'll see you next week on Tuesday, but do stay safe. As always, I've been Michael Linke here at the Institute of Architects. Great to spend time with you. Stay safe and look forward to seeing you again soon at a future leading session. Thanks very much. Have a great day.